Hello, my name is Jacob Eikenberry, MSW and PhD candidate at St. Louis University. I'm also research faculty at the Institute for Justice Research and Development at Florida State University. Today, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my understanding as a researcher and through my lived experience, the disease of addiction, and improving care through better understanding of addiction. And first, I'd like to say this is not ideal for me to be here this way, but unfortunately, my body did not communicate with my brain that playing basketball with 25-year-olds was not advisable in your 40s. So I learned the hard way and broke my wrist, and I'm probably recovering from surgery right now. But I do look forward to meeting and working with you all in the future. The first thing I'd like to say is I'd like to thank Barbara, who has went out of her way to kind of communicate with me, make me feel welcome, and help me get familiar with all of the amazing work that Project 180 is doing. I love their comprehensive services, their focus on the stability and well-being of formerly incarcerated and transitioning individuals. And their priority areas are very much in line with evidence-based practice. And again, I know that it works from my perspective of having lived experience. So I'll dive right into talking a little bit about me and my personal experience. I grew up in a family that there's a strong likelihood that there was undiagnosed and untreated mental illness and substance use issues. And a variety of dysfunctional behavior that was very, very difficult to endure as a child. When I was about 15 years old, I stole a car to run away from home. And this is zooming past a lot of other things. I stole a car to run away from home. I wrecked that car in a police chase. And I was incarcerated for the first time. I went into incarceration with a lot of trauma and an inability to communicate what was going on with me, how I felt, how I was doing. I just didn't know the answers to those questions, and I was very shut off from the world around me. I also had began using drugs at about the age of 14, and drinking alcohol excessively. This helped relieve an internal calamity that I couldn't identify or share with anybody else. And so that lived experience carried with me when I went into incarceration at 16 with those untreated and undiagnosed PTSD, substance use disorder, among other things. Without a way to address them, I don't like sharing this stuff, maybe. I went into incarceration with probably a minor in marijuana, and I came out doing the skills that I learned to survive there with a master's in violence. And I became a person that I didn't want to be, and that I felt a lot of regret and shame over the next 13 years of practicing addiction. Also, when I got out that next year at 17 years old, I increased my drug use behavior and escalated from drinking excessively and using marijuana to using cocaine, using heroin, and becoming an IV drug user. Over the next 13 years, I was incarcerated several times in several different states. Usually incarceration acted as an interruption to continued drug use, which on the one hand was beneficial, but on the other hand, being in those criminal justice environments with untreated and undiagnosed mental illness and substance use issues, and no resources to treat them, I often came out worse than when I went in. We know that up to 97% of males that are incarcerated and have at least one, if not more, what are called lifetime traumatic experiences. And this is situations in where you fear for your life or somebody else's. And oftentimes, if you've had one or two of those lifetime traumatic experiences, they seem to have a clustering effect in that you have 10 or 11. So it's kind of a multiplier. So those folks that are most vulnerable to experiencing those kinds of things experience them a lot. You know, I've heard that some of the clients at Project 180 have said things like, nobody ever wanted me around. And I could tell you, as a child, before I found alcohol and drugs, I felt that nobody wanted me, that there was no place for me, and that and I was suicidal before I found alcohol and drugs. So I will say that when I did finally find alcohol and drugs, it was an incredible relief to me. Up to that point in my life, I knew two emotions really well. That was fear and relief. Relief was not joy. It was just the absence of continued fear. So that's part of my story. Also, while I was incarcerated, since I was incarcerated several times, I would come into contact with a variety of other people that experienced things very similar to my situation. One of those situations that I'd like to discuss is something that happened when I was incarcerated at 25 years old. And I became very good friends with another incarcerated person named Fats. And Fats and I were very similar in some ways. We both read lots of books, consumed, knowledge. We both loved playing basketball. And Fats was, charismatic and funny, and I have a few of those traits sometimes. And so, because we were both diabetic, we would walk to get our insulin at the same time, and Fats was black and I was white, and so oftentimes, even in incarceration settings, there's a lot of segregation. But during this time, we would share little bits and pieces about our life, this shared time together. And at one point, I shared with him some things that happened when I was a child, and his response about the person that perpetuated that harm on me was, I would have killed him. And some people might interpret that as, very scary, very violent. Me, for where I was when I was there, is I interpreted that as love, as care. And it had a profound effect on the way that I saw the world. The most interesting thing, though, and the biggest difference between Fats and I, was not the color of our skin, not that he was from inner city Baltimore, and a family that was all gang involved. It was that no matter how far down the scale I had gone, and the crowning achievement of my life at that time was 25 years old, was I had a GED that I got while I was incarcerated. I was a father, but I wasn't a good father. I wasn't a present father. And I just didn't have a lot going for me, and I had been periodically homeless for several years. So despite all that trauma, the biggest difference between Fats and I was that even though I still had hope, like I had this idea that if I really wanted to do something different and the tools were at my disposal, I would do it. And what struck me as very powerful was that Fats did not have that. He didn't have hope in a future beyond becoming incarcerated and dying young. And for a while, I thought that that was an individual deficit, like a perception problem. And what I didn't understand at the time was cumulative disadvantage. I didn't understand the power of maybe having a teacher that wasn't in a poor community, only able to attend to the behavioral health needs of their students and not the scholastic needs. I had a teacher that told me I was smart. I had a teacher that told me I could do anything. And the cumulative effect of that on our developing brain was significant when you compared Fats and I. What I realized is that he didn't have that. He didn't hear that. He didn't know that. And so I came to discover that the way that Fats interpreted the world and thought his future, the way that he saw his future in the world, was rooted in, it was rational. It was based on lived experience. It was based on what was happening. So this bothered me. It bothered me for several years. And around the age of 29, the ripe young age of 29, I checked into a treatment center for the second time in my life, and under an incredible amount of pressure from the outside, an incredible amount of consequences, still not being a father, still when I was being a father, not a very great father. And I went to treatment again to try to stay out of prison for charges that I was facing. And at that point, I still couldn't identify that I had a problem. I remember the person that dropped me off at the treatment center, they had to take me there it was 60 miles away, and they had to drop me off at the door and take my car and leave and take my wallet because I knew that I would leave as soon as I could. And the only way for me to go into the door was high, and the only other way for me to go into the door is I looked at that person that brought me and said, I'm just going in to try to reduce because of court, right? And they said, right. And I may not have gotten out of the car if that wasn't communicated to me. But at that time, unbeknownst to me, was the beginning of a trajectory of sobriety. As when I got sober, May 12th of 2009, I enrolled in that treatment center where I did not want to be, and I started going to some different recovery outlets that I did not want to be at. I started hearing things that I did not want to learn because everything was uncomfortable, and I was learning all these uncomfortable things without drugs, which was my only solution to that internal calamity that seemed to kind of never go away. Through the help of counselors, social workers, very comprehensive, being surrounded by, very similar to what Project 180 attempts to do for its clients, being surrounded by social workers, my probation officer, counselors, et cetera, a variety. I mean, if they were available to help, they were employed by me to help. And I needed all of that support in order to step out of the way of life that I had embraced. And I was living like a wild and wounded animal. And so when I stepped out of that treatment center, I checked into an Oxford House, which is a recovery home for other folks in recovery, other men. And I lived there for a year and a half. And during that time, notably, in the early periods of my sobriety, I still had a few brain cells left. I remember talking to my mom on the phone one time, and she said, during this time, and she said, Jake, I'm just so glad you didn't kill all your brain cells, because that's all you ever had going for you. And so I applied to a community college. I was also a single father at that time, so I was getting plenty of resources and help learning how to be a dad, and because I didn't know. I knew what not to do, but I didn't know what to do. And so again, I needed all this surrounded, comprehensive help, because learning the right way is so much easier than unlearning the wrong way, And so I received a lot of that help, and I began college for the first time. I was taking 2 classes at a time, and I began that journey of education. It continued for the next several years. It took me a short 4 years to get an associate's degree, and at that time I applied for and was accepted into an undergraduate psychology program. Notably, I was denied where I had all the resources and people, entrance into the psychology program at the city that I lived in. So I had to, take my daughter from our little one-bedroom apartment and uproot to another community. And I was denied because my history of incarceration, although it was all drug involved, prevented that university from feeling that I was ready to be there. But I was accepted somewhere else. I moved, continued that education. When I was finished, I thought, why not get into a master's program? And then I applied to Washington University in St. Louis, a Master of Social Work program, and I got in. And then when I was finished, despite the misgivings of my wife, I thought, why not try a PhD program? And so long story short, my research over the last 6 years has been around peer support and the vital role that peers play in the transition of folks from prison to the community, and from using drugs to abstinence or to harm reduction. Also, I'm very interested in systems that interact with the incarcerated population, including police, state prosecutors, all those correctional systems, the Department of Corrections, jails, and then reentry organizations and the work that they do, helping to facilitate the transition from prison and jail to the community. I have served as, a volunteer, going in, taking different meetings, taking different programming into folks in jails for many years now. I've worked alongside police, prosecutors, correctional professionals to implement programming. So I'm excited to be here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the way that I see addiction, both from my lived experience and research. And I think the most important concept that needs to land in order to approach any sustainable solution is that the conceptualization of a problem is important, in that it informs the solution. And so in other words, you might say that if I think the problem is using drugs, you're using too many drugs, you're drinking too much, then the solution is very cut, dry, and easy. It's stop using drugs. And for many years, we have, and if you do use drugs, we'll incarcerate you or incapacitate you for a series of time in order to promote your safety and public safety in turn. And if that was the solution, then mass incarceration would have worked. However, we saw mass incarceration, this phenomenon, through the war on drugs and policy changes at every level of government across the country to align with this heavy war on drugs, skyrocket rates of incarceration, but not reduce substance use behavior and not increase public safety. In fact, much of what was happening there is, as I described earlier, going in with the minor in marijuana and coming out with the master's in violence, is folks were going to what has been termed crime school, right? And so instead of addressing the underlying issues, causes, and conditions that affect addiction, the trauma, the biopsychosocial history, the environmental pieces, by incarcerating somebody, they go in and learn how to participate further. They exacerbate their trauma, they deepen their trauma, and they add additional traumas to that person's life. And so when they get out, it's not a stretch to imagine that they're more likely to perpetuate harm, thus decrease public safety. And so we do know, researchers also know, that substance use abuse treatment or use treatment is cheaper, it's more effective than incarcerating. We know that substance abuse treatment translates to increased public safety. But researchers have a long way to go in understanding the disease of addiction. There are 4 dominant theoretical models that seek to explain the disease of addiction and the treatment that follows. What I can say is that those 4 models all have in common is that all these prominent theories of addiction share that well-being and increasing the well-being of the sufferer is the most pivotal thing that you can do in addressing addiction. And so seeing addiction, right, as a disease, as it is defined by the American Psychological Association, by Diagnostic and Statistical Manual and criteria, allows for providing the best services possible to mitigate addiction and its consequences. Research has, shown again that well-being and a strengths-based focus on substance use and on treatment helps the participant become more likely to embrace, engage with, and participate in behaviors that translate to recovery, that translate to less recidivism. These are secondary outcomes that translate to long-term recovery, that translate to increased public safety, that translate to better lives of their families, of themselves, and of their communities. Here at the Institute for Justice Research and Development in 2016, we started looking at what are those domains of well-being, so to speak, that if we increase these domains, that the person's likelihood of transitioning successfully from prison to the community, which is riddled with difficulties, which I know that you all are familiar with. What are those domains of well-being? And we did a systematic review by combing through over 100,000 articles, and we would meet every Friday, and we would meet with researchers and unpack these articles, and we would meet with formerly incarcerated individuals and unpack these articles where interventions were conducted with individuals involved in the criminal justice system. And we were looking for evidence-based interventions and themes across interventions. And we came up with, through this very rigorous, very long systematic review, were 5 domains of well-being for reentering populations. And that's effective coping strategies, healthy thinking patterns, positive relationships, positive social engagement, and meaningful work trajectories. And underneath each of these 5 keys of well-being, there are several interventions that have evidence base, that work with these populations. And we started thinking about moving away from a risk-need responsivity, deficits-focused model of rehabilitation, of recovery, of successful transition from prison to the community, towards a strengths-focused, a well-being orientation. And through this work, we developed this 5-key model and have been using it in now over 100 correctional facilities across 7 states. We actually just added an 8th state, and so we're partnering with the Department of Corrections professionals, jails, we're partnering with police, we're partnering with state prosecutors, and we're infusing and integrating and modifying this 5-key intervention to fit into these different spaces to improve well-being across the sequential intercept model and the criminal justice system. This is a significant change in the way that we use correctional services, and it has the potential to change the lives not only of the individuals that are primary impacts, but their families, their kids, their partners, and their communities at large. And so I'm going to talk just a little bit about different modalities of recovery. We do know that responsive treatment is paramount for individuals and serves as an entry point to helping those individuals recover from a hopeless state of mind and body. And so a lot of those entry points come across different places. There are abstinence-only recovery-oriented places, such as 12-step groups. There are alternative, recovery meetings smart recovery, refuge recovery, that use a variety of services to help the person, A, connect to community, B, change their thinking, and C, become a productive member of society and their community at large. These are all viable paths to recovery. There is no one way or one size fits all. It's often individualized, and they all should be at the services of social workers or treatment providers. Should have a knowledge of all of these different avenues, because one size does not fit all. And also, a very big topic lately over the last several years has been harm reduction, which is not necessarily abstinence only, but harm reduction often is a bridge to sometimes abstinence only programming. And so harm reduction might look like, if you're using heroin, injecting heroin, you move back to, using not injecting heroin, or you're using marijuana. And so while these might not include an abstinence component, arguably, and statistically, it's statistically significant, helps increase a person's well-being and reduce the burden of interpersonal violence on the community. And so these are viable paths. They also help, oftentimes harm reduction methods often help keep somebody alive. So again, all of those ways are viable paths to recovery. And we've seen, with some of our newer understandings, we've seen, different changes at law enforcement, at the prosecutorial level, to account for the disease of addiction, and an improved understanding of addiction, and to promote healing. There are alternative treatment courts that are popping up across the country. At IJRD, we are creating a trauma-informed gun diversion program, for example, while not necessarily relating to substance use. Many of the folks that end up in incarceration situations have substance use issues. We move towards the integration of peers into courts, with corrections across the sequential intercept model. So peers, in other words, those with lived experience, are working with police, they're working with state prosecutors, they're working in treatment courts, they're working in correctional environments, they're working at reentry organizations. And these peers are working directly with people with substance use history, and their substance use history informs and increases engagement with services that in the past other providers have provided. These folks that are coming out of incarceration, they have substance abuse histories, they don't trust anybody. And sometimes, like in the story with FATS, rightly so. They have not been around systems of care that they could trust. And so they don't trust anybody. What a peer does is come in, they come from the same place, they're not judging, and they're there to help people. They're called linkage facilitators in some groups. So they're there to help people connect to and engage with the resources that improve well-being. So this is very forward, and we are trying to integrate peers across several different places at the Institute for Justice Research and Development. So I'm gonna kind of end with, most of this that I've been talking about today is not something that social workers can just dream up and draw a blueprint for and hand off to other people doing the work. There are duties and responsibilities that each actor across the correctional justice system, the correctional legal system have. And we would be remiss if we didn't recognize and say that. And so the only way for us to undo some of the harm that's done, and move towards reimagining a justice-oriented environment that can promote recovery for individuals that suffer, is together, is across correctional professionals, is across social workers, is across policymakers, and the problems are difficult, some of which I've described, but many of which you probably are already familiar with. And so my call to you is to help reimagine this justice system together. It's a great question, and I appreciate the question. And so the question is, how do these guys give back to the community? And what we know about incarcerated populations is that, for example, we work with lifers in Nebraska, and many of these folks have been down for 15 to 20 years, and they're now in positions to provide education, resources. They even facilitate some programming to other folks that remind them of them, that are coming in but are going to go back out into the community. And really what they want to do, where they find meaning and where they find purpose, which are necessary components of an identity change, is in giving back. And thereby, this may be invisible to the larger community, but they're making the community safer by the work that they do, both on themselves, the services they've received, and on others at large. And they're impacting people that they don't even know. And so again, some of this is invisible. And I know that when nonprofit agencies take in somebody like me or somebody like me, and they work with them to establish well-being, to establish sobriety, to establish contentment with that sobriety, and to establish resources and opportunities, and helping that person engage with those resources and opportunities, they create a pathway that didn't exist before. I'm going to say that these peers are invaluable, naturally occurring, and sustainable resources if we utilize and tap into them. And the impact that they have on the individual's family, and their community at large is immeasurable. So the question is about the different responsibilities that police, probation officers, and prosecutors whose clients are often victims of violent crime have in, helping assist the situation. Now, given all those people are playing very significant and very necessary functions of a healthy, safe, and just society. I remember being in a class during my master's program with a former police chief, and the police chief was educating us and helping us create with him, this is social workers, a therapeutic model of policing. Often my pushback with this particular police chief was, this is great. It's a bunch of social workers getting together and deciding what police are going to do in the future to improve everything. But I don't think it's going to land very well. And so if this is going to land very well, we need to have police in the room. We need to have the people, we need to have some of these complexities described in the room. We need to wrestle through them together. We need to reimagine, again, a just, fair, and safe society together. What we do know is what's currently happening is not working. Police don't like it. Social workers don't like it. Correctional professionals don't like it. Public safety is not better. And so we have to come back to the table and reimagine how to create this together. And I will say that that is possible, but it requires your participation.